We all know that the Frierdiker Rebbe had tremendous Mesiras Nefesh for Yiddishkeit. But we don't necessarily appreciate how profound that Mesiras Nefesh is until the Rebbe explains it to us, linked to the double parasha Chukas-Balak and aligned with the three major chapters of the Frierdiker Rebbe's leadership. The Rebbe often quotes the Shalah who teaches us that every special occasion, whether it be a Yontiv or even a rabbinic special occasion on the Jewish calendar, are always related to the parashas when those particular events happen. Therefore, is verstandig, from which we can derive as the Chag Geula von Yud Gimel Tammuz, at the celebration and festival of the Frierdiker Rebbe's redemption. Liberation from the Stalinist prisons, which happened over the 12th and 13th of Tammuz, and the Rebbe, the Shveri, and Ganze befreit geworden von seinem Meister and Golos, when his liberation was complete. Hat der Sheichas Teichen from the Parashas Chukas-Balak is related to Parashas Chukas-Balak, where it often falls out, and as we'll see, there's a relationship to Chukas, a relationship to Balak, and a relationship to how the parashas come together. And in dem Gufa sein und der drei Nekudas, the three areas to focus on. Aleph, the Sheichas Parashas Chukas, which will be the lion's share of the Sicha, what Chukas teaches us about the Beis Gimel Tammuz. Beis, the Sheichas to Parashas Balak, understanding that will also then appreciate how Balak helps us to understand the Frierdiker Rebbe's story of Mesiras Nefesh, and then Gimel the Sheichas Beide Sedras zusammen, the fact that the two of them come together. Warum we gerät viel mal, because also something the Rebbe has discussed numerous times is when zwei Sedras eine Mechaboris, when there are two parashas that are linked, und wir lehnen sie zusammen in ein Shabbos, and therefore we read them simultaneously on one Shabbos, is a Schabros in an Ofen as a very ein Sedra, then it's not two different parashas. On that Shabbos, it actually becomes a single long parasha. The Chalukas Hakriya is a Shiva Kruim. We still only read call up seven people to the Torah across the two parashas. And as is done in Haftarah, there's also just one Haftarah for both of the parashas together. Of a Meles Verstandig, which leads us to understand, as is Zugov Zunden Bazunden, Teichen was is da, in Yed Seder Bifnei Atzma, in addition to whatever the theme might be of Chukas on its own and Balak on its own, is doing Teichen Meshuta von Beide Sedras. There's also a common theme between both of the parashas, was der Farken and Ischaber Veren Al Sein Sedra, which is how it's possible that these two could come together to become a single parasha. In context of our conversation, the Sheichas from Chag HaGeula Beis Gimel Tammuz so Chukas-Balak is Eichet to Zei Teichen Meshutov. So therefore the link between Yud Beis Gimel Tammuz is not only to Chukas and not only to Balak, but also to the two parashas as they come together. This is Mudgash and Kvish Anazoi, was Yud Beis Tammuz is Chol B'Shabbos from Chukas-Balak. It's especially highlighted this year where Yud Beis Tammuz falls in the week of this double parasha Chukas-Balak. So we'll start with Chukas, understand what Chukas means, the word, the principle, the theme that it conveys, how that relates to Yud Beis Tammuz, and then from there Balak, and then the combination of the two. Chukas will be the anchor. The name from the Ershe Sedra is Chukas, as we well know. The first parasha is called Chukas, which means the pashta tait from Chukah is, what is a choik? Atziva was men hat niken tamefem. It is an instruction given by Hashem without any rational explanation. The only reason that we fulfill this particular mitzvah is because the Eibishter said so. This is the law that the Eibishter made. This is the decree he decreed. And thus they're from the Eibishter. That's what the Eibishter wants. We do it. So Chukas represents a complete dedication to Hashem. I don't need to understand it in order for me to commit to do it. Therefore, the union for Chuk and Avodah Sodom is the Avodah for Mesiras Nefesh. Was is L'mayna Meitam V'das? We could therefore understand how Chukas could speak to the theme of Mesiras Nefesh, because Mesiras Nefesh, the willingness to sacrifice ourselves or our interests for Hashem, starts off by saying, I'm not going to limit my Judaism to what I understand. I'll even do things that Hashem expects of me that are beyond my understanding. Warum? Seichel can gefinnen time to tun solche Sachen, was eine Meisif im Metzius so schlimmes Adam. The nature of the rational mind is, it can be used as a tool to get us to do something that we can see the benefit of, how it's going to add to our lives. But the intellect is never going to explain, oh, you know what, it actually makes sense to give up, to throw away your life, to lose your identity. By the way, that's why there is no direct mitzvah in the Torah to have Mesiras Nefesh, for obvious reasons. The entire concept of Torah, specifically the written Torah, is divine wisdom. And the principle of Mesiras Nefesh is beyond wisdom. So the key to being able to have Mesiras Nefesh is the attitude of Chukah. I'll do what the Eibishter says, absolutely. Und das ist Sheiches von den Teichen von Chag HaGelut Beis Gimel Tammuz to Parshas Chukas. So that's the easy link between the story of Yud Beis Gimel Tammuz, which is the story of the Frierdiker Rebbe's Mesiras Nefesh, L'mayne Mitam Das, the Avodah of Chukah, with the Parasha of Chukas. The Avodah from Bala Gula V'Simcha Farabotz HaTorah in Yena Medina, the Frierdiker Rebbe's work to spread Torah in that place, behind the Iron Curtain, was der Far Ottoman arrestiert, which is what caused him to arrest him, is given an Anofen von Chukas. That was an Avodas Hashem, which is Chukas. Mit Mesiras Nefesh and L'mayne Mitam Das, it took absolute sacrifice, completely beyond the rational expectations. Als sich einer allein gegenstellte Geseres von einem Mimshala Takifa Varitza. Think about it this way. The Frierdiker Rebbe, as an individual, stood up to the laws of an overwhelmingly powerful regime. Und in der Medina, was like dem damaligen Matzafung ist kemat nicht möglich gewesen, zu herausgehen von ihrer Gewullos. Especially when you consider that it was near impossible to leave the country. So the Frierdiker Rebbe is standing up against the government where there is no escape, and the government is really powerful, and against him. It doesn't make sense. Von deswegen hat sich im Ganzen nicht gerechnet mit alles zakonnetige Maniers wie Kumim und hat getan seine Arbeit von Avodas HaTorah V'Yadas mit Mesiras Nefesh. Nevertheless, the rational mind would say there's absolutely no room to do what the Frierdiker Rebbe did. But that's exactly the point. The Frierdiker Rebbe went with an attitude of Mesiras Nefesh. We're going to do what we have to do to spread Yiddishkeit at whatever cost, or even if it does not make sense. That's the general link to Chukas. Let's drill down into the word Chukah or Chukas and understand it even more specifically. The name for the Seder Leit Minig Yisrael is not Chukas HaTorah, even though the pasuk that introduces this parasha says Zois Chukas HaTorah. This is the law of Torah. We don't actually call it that. Colloquially, we just call it Chukas Stam. The time the Ruf kemen sagen, and there's a reason for it. The Chukah from Para Aduma, the core mitzvah of this parasha, which is the Para Aduma, which is a choik, wegen welcher sich in der Seder, is always geteilt euch von anderen Chukim damit, was is legamre nicht im Geder Seicha Vasoga. There are other Chukim in the Torah that are super rational, but have some kind of a link back to a rational explanation. The Para Aduma has none at all. Was der Pfarrer hat afil Shlomo HaMelech, der Chacham mikol Adam gesagt. That's why you find Shlomo HaMelech, the wisest person ever, said, Al kol Eliomati, all the other Chukim, I was able to come to some kind of an understanding of Parasha Shal Para Aduma, whereas this one, the story of Para Aduma, this week's Parasha, Omarti Achakma, I said I'd be wise enough to be able to understand it, and it is completely beyond me. So the Chukah of Para Aduma is in a category of its own. Generally, Chukim represent Avodah, which is the L'mayne Mitam Das and Mesiras Nefesh. Para Aduma is in a unique category, even within that world. That's why the pasuk says, this one, this is Chukas HaTorah. As the mitzvah from Para Aduma is the einzige Chukah from Gans Torah, this is the one and only true chok in the whole of Torah. Because even relative to other chukim, this is inexplicable. This is the one that really stands in the category of being totally outside of the bounds of anything rational. Und damit ist moving was die said Chukas Stam und nicht Chukas HaTorah. That explains why we call the parasha Chukas, not linking it as an adjective of Chukas HaTorah. Why do we do that? Because yes, any choik is beyond the rational mind. But the rational mind is capable of acknowledging as the mensch that a human shouldn't always lean on his personal understanding. But sometimes has to also do things that he doesn't understand. In the same way as I suppose a parent can tell a child, sometimes there are things you have to trust me, and the parent just do it even if you don't understand it. But the mind will only tolerate the possibility of doing something which makes no sense, as long as the thing that makes no sense is not counterintuitive. As long as the human mind can say, look, I don't understand it, but somebody or somewhere in another level of wisdom there is an explanation, fine, I'll accept the higher authority. Whereas paraduma was the hadaga von chukka was hat niken achizin seichel. Not only is paraduma super rational, it is hefech seichel. It's counter rational. Right? A whole lot of the processes make absolutely no sense. It's not just that humans don't understand paraduma, but don't worry, somewhere else there is an explanation. No, even in the Chochmah of Torah, there is no explanation for paraduma. Die Chukah is in Mekayim, not mit det nur vom Bittul zum Eibishten's Ratzon. This is the ultimate choik, because this is where a Jewish person who fulfills this mitzvah is doing so only out of absolute dedication and complete surrender to Hashem. That is a choik. That's what we really mean when we speak about chukas, and that is the type of Mesiras Nefesh the Frierdiker Rebbe has. Because there are actually two different types of Mesiras Nefesh which exist. There is the Mesiras Nefesh that a person could have with a rational basis. Yes, it'd be a holy rational basis of a forta cheshman, but it doesn't matter what kind of rational basis is. There is seichel. There is some calculation involved. What does that mean? As Adam and gate of Mesiras Nefesh, that means a person is about to say, look, I'm willing to dedicate my life to Hashem at all costs, if the Torah expects it of me. So you first consult the Shulchan Aruch. Does the Torah expect me to have Mesiras Nefesh in this scenario? If yes, I'll do it. If not, I won't. So if it's Yehorik V'al Yavor, okay, amen. If it's something which is maybe, a Chalal Olav Shabbos Achas or something like that, that maybe it's better for me to break this law so I can continue to live, maybe I won't have Mesiras Nefesh. And das is Chukas HaTorah. That's what we allude to when we talk about the adjective, a choik within Torah. Says the Chukah Mesiras Nefesh, Chukah represents complete sacrifice, but in this case, it's Chukim as designed and delineated by the Torah. Aligned with holy rationale. So it's absolutely Mesiras Nefesh with rules and limits. The zweite from Mesiras Nefesh is there's a completely different style of Mesiras Nefesh. The Mesiras Nefesh that has no limits, no thought process that contains it. Was die Darga from Mesiras Nefesh von Chukas Stam. That is not called Chukas HaTorah. That's just complete chukah, complete dedication to Hashem without any restriction whatsoever. This is a level of dedication that is even beyond what is called Chukas HaTorah. Because in order to have this level of dedication, you've got to call on the essence of your neshama. The source of our neshama is actually from a higher designation than the source of the Torah. And this is not Chassidus, this is in Igla de Torah, the very well-known statement, that the thought, which is the root of the Jewish people, preceded the thought, the root of any other thing Torah included. When we speak about the essence connection between a Jew and Hashem, it's not a connection built through Torah or structured by Torah. That produces a Mesiras Nefesh that is completely beyond any calculation or any thought process whatsoever. It is this kind of Mesiras Nefesh that the Frierdiker Rebbe had, not ordinary Mesiras Nefesh, which may have existed across many examples in history. This is the unique, absolute Mesiras Nefesh where I cannot detach from Hashem, and therefore I'm going to do things that even Torah wouldn't necessarily be able to explain. Let's see how this plays out in practice in the Frierdiker Rebbe's life. There are many, many areas that the Frierdiker Rebbe worked with Mesiras Nefesh in order to achieve. Schicken Rabbonim und Sheichtim, and wo sie haben Neues gefällt, he sent Rabbonim and Sheichtim to places that lacked them. Aufstellen Mikvois, he established mikvahs, ginden yeshivas for alter bachrim, made yeshivas, chadarim fatina k'shveis chulei, as well as schools. But where was the main issue that the government had with the Frierdiker Rebbe? Was das given the Iker Sibbe, was man hat im Rebbe arrestiert, which led obviously to his incarceration, ist gewesen nicht als lieb seine Arbeit in Arbotzes HaTorah v'Chizuk HaYadus zwischen der Erwachsenen und älteren Juden. The government didn't take such exception to the Frierdiker Rebbe's involvement in spreading Judaism amongst adults. No hauptsächlich zu lieb sein abgeben sich mit den Chiluchen von Tammuz Rabban. The real battlefront was they took issue with the Frierdiker Rebbe investing in the education, Torah education of children. Und nicht gucken dich auf alle Sakonis, and regardless of all the danger that posed to the Frierdiker Rebbe, als sich der Rebbe hereingeworfen darf in dem Zug Arbeit mit einer besonderen Sturm und Islavus und mit der Gottgröße von ihm. So even though that was the most dangerous part of the Frierdiker Rebbe's work to establish education, Torah education for children, that's Dafka where the Frierdiker Rebbe put in the most energy, most enthusiasm, the most work. You could ask a question. Of course, you have to engage in strengthening and spreading Torah and Yiddishkeit in Russia. But why do you choose to dafka go down the route where you have the least chance of success? The whole government is focused on stopping this particular area, educating children. Surely the priority should have been first areas where even in the natural course you could imagine some success. Und nicht an die Arbeit in einem Öfen verstellt, bederch HaTev und Sakona, die ganze Avodas HaTorah auf alle Gebieten. Why would the Frierdiker Rebbe invest all of his effort in the one area of outreach that theoretically could threaten all the other areas of outreach? Und da ist es mir noch größer, and it's a huge, perplexing thought. How could the Frierdiker Rebbe potentially jeopardize the spreading of Torah and educating of adults who are obligated, they're over by mitzvah, they're obligated to do Torah mitzvahs, in favor of the education of children who are not yet obligated to do Torah mitzvahs? Al-pi Torah, Chukas-Balak, this should not have been the strategy of how to keep Judaism alive under Stalin's nose. So why did the Frierdiker Rebbe go this way? As the Avodah Rebbe is given an Ofen von Emerson and Chukas. The Frierdiker Rebbe's dedication to Torah, dedication to Hashem, was true Chukas. Mesiras Nefesh on keine cheshbonis, as we've explained, where the Mesiras Nefesh doesn't first have to have parameters and logic and a basis. It's just absolute dedication to what Hashem wants. Wissendig sein Shlichus, the Frierdiker Rebbe identified and knew what his Shlichus was. As an Nasi Yisrael was darf sorgen für Kinder von Klal Yisrael. The Frierdiker Rebbe identified that he is the Nasi, he's therefore responsible for the entire Jewish nation. If you want to ensure the future of a Jewish nation, you have to invest in the education of their children. As the famous Gemara tells us, if there are not kids, there won't be goats. Hat sich der Pfarrer reingelegt mit der größten Mesiras Nefesh Beine und aufhalten Chadarim für gar kleine Kinder. So therefore the Frierdiker Rebbe went all in to ensure the education of children. Setzt sich nicht, als die Arbeit soll sein, yeah, if you think about it logically, following the course of nature, it did not seem like there were great prospects for the endurance of this particular shlichus. Didn't look like it would last, didn't look like it would be effective. Und wenn das Wort gewinnt am Mesiras Nefesh, was ist möglich und abgemassen nicht Cheshbonis von Seichel HaTorah, dann wollte gewinnt ein Ort für Azatayna. So yeah, you're right. If the Frierdiker Rebbe had followed the rules of a logical, Torah-based logical approach to his Mesiras Nefesh, he would have said, this actually doesn't make sense and maybe I shouldn't prioritize it. But that's not the Frierdiker Rebbe's Mesiras Nefesh. Seeing as the Frierdiker Rebbe's Mesiras Nefesh was absolutely beyond anything that is rational, so therefore it wasn't relevant to start processing a logical process. What are the prospects of success? Or what are the prospects of him being able to escape the net of the government? Das gehört zum Eibishter. That's the Eibishter's business. My business is I have to do what I have to do. Al derech wie Hananiah, Mishael und Azariah haben gesagt, Nebuchadnezzar. We have a precedent in history. Hananiah, Mishael and Azariah were being forced by Nebuchadnezzar to bow to an idol. They responded. They said, if we deserve it, the Eibishter would somehow miraculously save us. But if not, if the Eibishter is not going to save us, that's the Eibishter's business. But our Mesiras Nefesh is we cannot bow to an idol. There's nothing to discuss. Even dann, wenn sie werden nicht geraten wird, ist es nicht der Fall, was Nebuchadnezzar hat sie Bechira Schuss Chas v'Shalom sie zu hargenen. So in their mind, they understood, if they're not going to be saved from Nebuchadnezzar, it's not because Nebuchadnezzar has power or even choice in the matter. Now, das ist von Eibishter. That's the Eibishter's decision that they would have to Chas v'Shalom. Nebuchadnezzar is nur ein Schleich von Eibishter durchzuführen das. And Nebuchadnezzar would simply be the agent that the Eibishter would use. And that's the Frierdiker Rebbe's mindset. I have to do what the Eibishter wants. I know my shlichus. I have to do it absolutely, without any compromise, without over-analyzing it. The Eibishter has to take care of whether or not that should work in my favor or not. So die Tage von Mesiras Nefesh in an Öfen von Chukas hat man beim Rebbe gesehen im Eschach von alle seinen Mesiras Jahren Balmadein. Now, it's obvious to us that the Frierdiker Rebbe had incredible Mesiras Nefesh when living in Stalinist Russia, but on observation we're going to discover that this tremendous Mesiras Nefesh the Frierdiker Rebbe had played out in two completely different scenarios over two other of the 3 decades of his leadership. Die 30 Mesiras Jahren was ein Gewinn eingeteilt in die 3 Tekufos von 10 Shonim. We know that the Frierdiker Rebbe was Rebbe for 30 years, and that was split into 3 decades of completely different focuses of Avodah. Der erste 10 Jahre Berech seien Gewinn verbunden mit der Avodah vom verspäten Terve Yadis in der Matzah von Sakolas Nefoshes Bepeil Mamish. The first decade approximately was primarily about spreading Yiddishkeit with absolute risk to his life. Die zweite Tkufa ist der Rebbe gewinnt in ein Land, wo sie haben gelebt, größte Zollen von Achene B'nai Yisrael. After that, the Frierdiker Rebbe lived in areas, Poland and so forth, which had great Jewish populations. Und es gewinnt am Mokim HaMatim zu verspäten Teres Chassidus without all the restrictions of Soviet Russia. So it was an ideal and fertile ground to spread Chassidus without limits. Aber das ist doch gewinn verbunden mit Hagbolas. But the truth is there were limits. Was der Sibbe ist gewinn different limits to what happened in Stalinist Russia. Vaikana by Echov, internal strife, internal other members of the Jewish community who opposed the Frierdiker Rebbe. Und der Rebbe wissendig, als wir haben schon mal es hat Dovra, als der Eibishter hat euch dort aufgelegt auf ihm, die Schlichus von Afotzes Atere Vachassidus. So in spite of the fact that the Frierdiker Rebbe had all kinds of opposition from other Jewish quarters, he understood that the Eibishter still wanted him to fulfill the same shlichus of spreading Yiddishkeit and specifically spreading Chassidus. He had just as much Mesiras Nefesh as in Russia to fulfill his shlichus in Poland. Und die dritte Tekufa ist gewesen in Chatzukadra HaTachton. The 3rd decade of the Frierdiker Rebbe's leadership happened in the so-called lower hemisphere of the world, in other words, in the United States. Dort, wo viele Jahre hat geherrscht, ja noch als Amerika ist anders, where the overarching attitude for decades and for generations was that America is a different place where Judaism is no longer relevant in the way that it was. The prevailing attitude was, this is not a land in which you could actually conduct yourself as a Jew as you should. Dort man gedarf sich stellen gegen einen mächtigen Strom und Einfalls in Chassidus in einen Ort, was ist äußerlich nicht gewesen, was so gelebt haben. So there the Frierdiker Rebbe had to literally swim upstream against a tremendous pushback to plant and engage in Torah mitzvahs and establish systems, schooling systems, yeshiva systems, etc., in an environment that seemed completely ill-suited to it, that it seemed that this would be an impossible task. So wie gesagt, alle 3 Tekufos seien gewinn verbunden mit einer Avodah von unbegrenztem Mesiras Nefesh. What's important to note over here is that there is absolute, unlimited Mesiras Nefesh in all 3 situations. It's not like it became easier, although Frierdiker Rebbe invested less of himself in the Mesiras Nefesh in these different scenarios. Aber in jeder Tekufa ist das gewinn in seinen Eufen. It's just that the way the Mesiras Nefesh played out is unique from decade to decade or scenario to scenario. Es ist eine der Meklal dem Mesiras Nefesh in die letzte 2 Tekufos zu dem Mesiras Nefesh von der erste Tekufa. It's clear that life in Poland and in America was nothing like life in Russia, and the Mesiras Nefesh was different. Was ist gewinn verbunden mit Sakolas Nefoshes Bepeil Mamish, because in Russia, the Frierdiker Rebbe's Mesiras Nefesh centered on real risk, not only to his life, or noch mehr. In seiner Avodah Arbeit damals hat der Rebbe eingestellt nicht nur sein eigenes Leben. In the Frierdiker Rebbe's work in Russia, not only did he put his own life on the line, no, hat geschickt andere auf Shlichusen. He also sent other people to do Shlichus, was ein Gewinn verbunden mit Sakonis Nefashis that endangered their lives. Und bei Rebben is doch Hazam Mesiras Nefesh. For a Rebbe, that kind of Mesiras Nefesh, to put other people's lives at risk, so stellen als Zweiten in den Sakona, als sach schwer und tiefer wie einstellen sich allein in Sakonis Nefashis, was much more profound and much more difficult than risking his own life. It's one thing if a person wants to, but a Rebbe has so much love for every single year to put other Yidden's lives in danger was a tremendous Mesiras Nefesh. Und noch mehr. Seine gewähren Fallen, wenn solche Schluchim seien entdeckt geworden von der Memeshola. There were, as we know, many instances where the Frierdiker Rebbe's Shluchim were exposed by the government. Seine verurteilt geworden zu Verschickung, zu Peinigungen, and they were sentenced to either exile or to various forms of punishment. Und doch hat man auf morgen darf widerstehen in der Tnur von Mesiras Nefesh, and then the next morning, the Frierdiker Rebbe would have to have again the same dedication of Mesiras Nefesh, und heute kommen Ainen und schicken ihm als Malamokim von der verschickten Shliach, to replace the exposed representative with a new Shliach who now was possibly in graver danger because the eyes of the NKVD were now directed to this particular institution, that particular project. Aber leidech ist in der zweiten Tekufe gewinn ein anderer und in einer gewissen Sinne harbere Schwierigkeit. In spite of how intensely difficult that Mesiras Nefesh was for the Frierdiker Rebbe, the second stage of his leadership was more subtle, but in a sense a more difficult kind of Mesiras Nefesh. Wenn man hat gedacht, beikommen der Minium von Tainis von Echov, because the Frierdiker Rebbe had to stand up to the contesting of his work by his own fellow Yidden. Why do you do things this way? Why not differently? For deswegen ist man mamshech die Arbeit, and yet the Frierdiker Rebbe kept his focus and continued to do his avoida. Das ist mit der Jedua noch schwerer wie die Frierdiker und vor der Tiefet nur von Mesiras Nefesh. To be able to stand up to a fellow Jew, to be able to stay focused when great leaders are speaking differently, that in a sense requires a deeper Mesiras Nefesh. Und Gott anders ist die Tnur von Mesiras Nefesh in der dritte Tekufa, and then again a completely different Mesiras Nefesh in the third decade and phase of the Frierdiker Rebbe's leadership. Wenn man hat gedacht gegen dem Strom, where the Frierdiker Rebbe had to literally fight against this overwhelming stream moving away from Yiddishkeit, nicht nispol werden von dem Allegim, not to be bothered by those people who were the detractors from what he was trying to do, und von die Stere v'cholim, people who try to interfere with his avodah. Und nach dem allem hat der Rebbe sich nicht begnügen mit aufbauen die eigene Daladamas. And with all the opposition, the Frierdiker Rebbe wasn't satisfied just to build up a healthy Chabad on American soil. Und dann sind gekommen, Joyatzi mit der Hatzor, sich einschließen in Zevanias, in Afshi Tzalti. People came up with ideas. This is what you should do. Make sure you just be happy after what's happened on the other side of the ocean, that you could at least preserve a Chabad community. Man kann nicht Melchama haben mit der ganzen Welt. Pick your battles. You can't fight against the entire world. Hat sich reingeworfen in der Arbeit zu verwandeln, das ganze Land in Makom Torah. The Frierdiker Rebbe wasn't happy just to look after himself. He went on the offensive to go and establish a Jewish presence, a Torah presence in America. Now here's the thing. When you have different areas of focus, we can expect some people are better at standing up against a regime than standing up within the Jewish community. Some people can fight assimilation, but they would never tolerate the threats of Stalin. Beim selben Menschen soll sein dieselbe Mesiras Nefesh in aller gar verschiedene Ifane Avoida. The natural way that humans are designed, it's not natural for one person to be equally dedicated with Mesiras Nefesh in completely different arenas. Warum? In einer Avoida, was man hat, eine Tier und Koch. Because if there's a particular kind of Avoida that you are predisposed to, or you are naturally enthusiastic about, is Mesiras Nefesh mehr wie in another Avodah. You'll obviously have more Mesiras Nefesh in that arena than you'll have in a different arena where you don't have the same enthusiasm or focus or predisposition. Wie kann aber sein dieselbe größte Tnur von Mesiras Nefesh bei die alle gar verschiedene Ifane Avodah? How is it that you have one person, the Frierdiker Rebbe, with equal Mesiras Nefesh in completely different environments? is the hasbara in them. Let's go back to the original thing that we said about chukas. This is the point of chukas. As beim Rebbe hat geleuchtet in the Kudas HaMesiras Nefesh, was nimmt sich von Etzem HaNefesh. The Frierdiker Rebbe's Mesiras Nefesh is the radiance of the essence of his neshama, which is absolute Mesiras Nefesh, not chukas ha-Torah, Mesiras Nefesh that makes sense within the rubric of Judaism. This is absolute Mesiras Nefesh. Was die Frage ist, kol milhusa given Mesiras Nefesh. So it's not that the Frierdiker Rebbe had Mesiras Nefesh for a particular situation. It's that the Frierdiker Rebbe is Mesiras Nefesh at the core of his being. Und der Rebbe ist kein Chelek nicht gewinnen, was verraziert der Kerch von Mesiras Nefesh hat sich gedacht anton. So it's irrelevant how the Mesiras Nefesh has to express itself. That's detail. And jeden Oifen HaAvodah is given dieselbe etzem dike Mesiras Nefesh, whichever channel is being used to manifest the Mesiras Nefesh doesn't undermine the fact that the Mesiras Nefesh is the core Mesiras Nefesh that comes from the essence of the soul. That's the message of Chukas. With that in mind, we can link the Frierdiker Rebbe story to Parshas Balak. Why? Der Schach zwischen dem Chag HaGeula und Parshas Balak. Chazal sagen, dass Balak hat Feind gehabt Eden Yoser mikol seinem. Chazal tell us that Balak was the greatest anti-Semite. Therefore, hat sich vermossen schlecht zu tun die Eden. That's why he calculated how he could harm the Jewish people, even though he knew that the Jews were not permitted to touch his land. In other words, there was no direct threat to him. And they had a direct divine instruction that they were not allowed to provoke his people into war. In other words, there's no threat whatsoever. It didn't matter. He simply couldn't tolerate the existence of Jewish people. Noch mehr. Viel nachdem wir heute gesehen, als allein kann sich nicht stellen gegen die Eden. His burning hatred is so powerful that even when he works out that he doesn't have the wherewithal to stand up to the Jewish people, hat sich hereingelegt mit der Tirche Gedöle bei Yoser und herabgebracht als zweiten Bilamen, als gedei bringen Schaden zu Eden. So he doesn't stop there and say, okay, listen, I hate them, there's nothing I can do about it. He doesn't rest until he finds somebody who he believes can chas v'shalom cause harm. This is very much what happened with the Frierdiker Rebbe at the time he was arrested. Because the avodah von Abatzat Torah is given, spreading Torah was, wie der Rebbe schreibt in seinem bewussten Brief zu Yud Tammuz, as the Frierdiker Rebbe clearly says in his well-known letter of Yud Tammuz, completely legal. There was no law outlawing spreading Judaism. The Meise Begolus is gekommen mit dem der Shona von die was haben gesucht nekem sein sich beschämt das Moshe Israel. So how did he land up in prison, the Frierdiker Rebbe? Because there were people who slandered the Frierdiker Rebbe because they had so much hatred for people who were dedicated to Yiddishkeit, neged Chukei HaMedina. And they actually went in an illegal route to have him arrested because there was no law against spreading Yiddishkeit. It was like a Bilam reincarnation in us, or a Balak reincarnation. Das heißt, als der Fall was haben nicht gekannt vertragen a frum in Yiddishkeit, because these were people who simply couldn't handle the thought of a frum Jew or the observance of Judaism. Haben sie sich hereingelegt mit der Yegea Gedola. They worked so hard, even against the law of the land, as long as they could undermine what the Frierdiker Rebbe wanted to do. And the story ended very similarly to how it does in the Parsha. So in the same way as in the story of Balak and Bilam, not only did Balak not achieve his objective, which was orally to chas v'shalom curse the Yidden, but to the contrary, sein Dingen Bilam hat Gott gebracht, sollen gebencht werden. The fact that he engaged Bilam to help him out actually turned the tables on him and brought brachas for the Yidden. Und durch Bilam and Gufa, not just brachas, but Bilam being the one giving those brachas, and Bilam was an even greater anti-Semite than Balak. Umit brachas nales b'yosef, not just ordinary brachas, but the most incredible brachas. The pasuk says that the Eibusha totally transformed the extreme curse into extreme bracha. Al derech zeh is given by the Bal Hagula v'Simcha. The same happened to the Frierdiker Rebbe. As the selber Menschen, was haben der Rebbe arrestiert, the exact same forces who arrested the Frierdiker Rebbe, sie allein haben gemusst heraushelfen in sein Shishler. They became the people who had to facilitate his release. Not only that, sie haben sich gar beim Mit, as the Rebbe soll von jeder Medina, they're actually the ones who had to then subsequently assist the Frierdiker Rebbe to leave Russia altogether. So the link to Chukas is the incredible Messias Nefesh that the Frierdiker Rebbe had, which is not Chukas HaTorah but Chukas Stam. And the link to Balak is the way the story plays out in exactly the same way as Balak. The hatred is the same and the miracle is the same. Now let's see what happens when you put the two of them together. Dennoch kommt die Sheiches von Chag HaGeula mit Chukas-Balak zusammen Kanal Sif Aleph. Now we've got to see what is the link between Yud Beis Tammuz and the double parsha. And that's going to give us a lesson for ourselves. The explanation is this. In the Snagdas was Balak hat gewesen zu ihnen, kämen noch gefinnen Epsatam Besiba. If you really want, you could find a justification for Balak's tremendous hatred of the Jewish people. Look at what he says. They're going to clean us out. They're going to kind of eat up all of our resources, like an ox that when it eats, it leaves nothing behind it. And ganz Moav, also we know that Bichlal, the people of Moav, were afraid of the Yidden, as the pasuk says, Vayagam Moav mipnei ha'am. Okay, so you get it. We can understand where Balak is coming from. In the same way as we said, there's Chukas is something which is irrational. Chukas-Balak means Balak. This in Balak is on Seichel. It is possible that there should be the kind of hatred to the Jewish people that is Chukas-Balak. Balak represents the hatred. Chukas-Balak is an irrational hatred of the Jewish people. Now, inam eifam fun Chukas. Noch mehr. Not only is there no logical reason why there should be a hatred of the Yidden, but it's actually counter logic to do something negative to the Jewish people. Because it cannot work. Look at the story of Balak and specifically of Bilam. When we get in the Sipur from Balak and Bilam, as Bilam had gewusst, as wird gar nicht auftan. Bilam knew before he began that there was no way he could succeed. He is a Navi who heard directly from Hashem. Don't even attempt to curse the Jewish people because they are fundamentally blessed. He knew there's no way that he could curse the people, which he was hired to do. He tells Balak, I cannot go against what Hashem wants. Whatever the Eibishter puts into my mouth, only that is what I can say. In spite of that, because he had this absolute core hatred of the Jewish people, he couldn't hold himself back. He tried to find a way to actually curse the Jewish people, knowing it's impossible. That's something that repeats internally inside every one of us. As we know, the famous teaching of the Frierdiker Rebbe in Basi Lagani, that there are crazy thought processes that Klippa produces in our minds, which are illogical. They're sublogical. Like many things that people do. Why? Simply because that's what everybody does. That's how the world conducts itself. Become these immutable laws that have absolutely no logical basis, like the examples the Frierdiker Rebbe gives in Basi Lagani, like the time that people eat and the times that people sleep. Generally speaking, those are carved in stone. Yet at the same time, when to daven, when to learn, that's flexible. Sometimes, sorry, couldn't get to learn today. Nobody turns around and says, sorry, I didn't get to eat today, I didn't get to sleep today. It's completely irrational behavior. It's the Balak inside of us, the Bilam inside of us. So the only alternative, the only antidote is Chukas, which is the Kedusha, that a person has to have a dedication to what the Eibishter wants in a completely super rational way. With the Rebbe is taught before him, like the Frierdiker Rebbe explains the Bas Elegani. And through that is Mamahafich the Shtus the Kilipa, it's Shtus the Kedusha that allows us the possibility of transformation. That what was this burning negative energy becomes a burning positive energy. The same forces who arrest the Frierdiker Rebbe are the ones who have to release him. In fact, there's even a story in the period that the Frierdiker Rebbe was in prison that illustrates this point. And from Chukas-Balak is Rebbe. So this Chukas-Balak, irrational behavior, played out in the Frierdiker Rebbe story. V'yado hat lamed, which must be lulav, right? Einer von den zwei Jiden was haben den Rebbe arrestiert. So one of the two Jewish people directly involved in the Frierdiker Rebbe's arrest. So he wanted to give out by arresting talking the Rebbe's pekel. He wanted to help the Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe, carry his bags at the time they were arresting him. What was his motivation? Zogendik, Chassidim bleiben Chassidim. He said, Chassidim remain Chassidim. Mein Zeh hat getragen die Pekel for Eier Zeden. And ich will tragen the Eier Pekel. My grandfather carried your grandfather's bags. I want to carry yours. Euch in a spätlicher Fall hat in seine Rede zum Rebbe ihm angerufen Rebbe. And there was also, later on, as the Frierdiker Rebbe records in his memoirs, there was a time where he addressed the Frierdiker Rebbe as Rebbe. And das hat wie der Mittler Rebbe hat gesagt, auf dem, was hat ihm auf dem Malchschen gewähnt. The Mittler Rebbe had a similar experience where he says, the person who slandered him at that time to the Tsarist authorities in order to have him arrested, von deswegen hat ihm angerufen Rebbe. And he also said Rebbe, talking about the Mittler Rebbe. And at that time, the Mittler Rebbe said, as pivich shiloi. It was what we would call today a Freudian slip. Bei ihm hat sich herausgehabt das, was beprimus an erkennt allein als das der Emes. His mouth exposed what he deeply understood to be the truth. That this is the Rebbe. The fact that this individual who arrested the Frierdiker Rebbe is now saying, but I want to be like my grandfather and carry your bags. And he called him Rebbe. That's because deep down inside his neshama, he knew the truth. And in spite of the fact that he knew the truth intrinsically, and especially after the fact that the Frierdiker Rebbe warned him that what he was doing was self-destructive and would bring upon him terrible suffering in the future, which is what happened. As ultimately, these same people who were involved in the Frierdiker Rebbe's arrest were eventually punished by the state. In spite of the sensitivity to the fact that it's a Rebbe, and the fact that the Frierdiker Rebbe warned him, and he still went about his business and behaved the way that he did. Because it was Shtus de Klippa. His opposition, like Bilam's opposition, makes no sense. But what were they up against, the Russians? They were up against the Rebbe who had Mesiras Nefesh Chukas. Absolute Mesiras Nefesh. Completely outside of the realm of logic. That completely neutralized all of their opposition to the extent that the enemies are, removed. The Rebbe doesn't finish the pasuk because it's a negative connotation. To the practical extent that they were the ones who had to liberate the Rebbe. And thanks to them, there's a new yontif that the Jewish nation gets to celebrate. And that is such a powerful yontif that it will eventually overturn the whole month of Tammuz to become a time of absolute celebration, speedily, through our efforts as well to overcome our Shtus de Klippa through the Shtus de Kedusha and complete dedication to Hashem L'mayim Mitav Das, which should help us to be part of the manifestation of the Hafichas Yomim Elu L'Sasin L'Simcha L'Mayim Tovim.